actually was not looking forward to watching the 2021 Diary of a Wimpy Kid movie. Not just because of the fact that going in, I heard that this movie doesn't have a good reputation, but also because of the horrific aftermath of that abomination of a fourth movie, and how this movie was pretty much piggybacking off of the live-action movie adaptation of the books. It's safe to say that going in, I knew exactly what I was going to get. Now, unlike Little Nemo, Adventures in Slumberland, or Thundercats, growing up, I was actually someone who read the books as well as watched the live-action movies. Yes, even that horrendous fourth movie. A fun fact to know about me is that I don't read books all that much, because oftentimes I lose a place in what I read, I'm not interested in what's going on, I don't memorize things very well, and I do get overwhelmed when too many things are in front of me at once. Although, Diary of a Wimpy Kid was one of the exceptions where I was actually interested in what was going on, to the point where I know how the characters are like the back of my hand. And I know how the live-action movies are like as well, so I have more than enough knowledge to judge this movie both as a movie and as an adaptation. So, to start off this review, let me ask you guys a good question. Have you guys seen the first live-action movie, where Greg and Rowley start middle school, Greg and Rowley have a hard time finding somewhere to sit at lunch, they antagonize a bunch of teens during Halloween, and Greg accidentally breaks Rowley's arm? Well, if you said yes to that exact question, you don't need to watch this movie, because this movie and the live-action version are the exact same movie. Yeah, that's actually the first major issue that I have with this movie. If you've watched the first live-action movie, you know exactly how this movie is going to play out. It's that predictable. Essentially, it's the same exact problem that I pointed out back during my rant on Tom and Jerry, Willy Wonka, and the Chocolate Factory, where it feels like they decided to take a look at the live-action movie and copy most of its elements, and only slightly change some moments here and there. But at the exact same time, it also ruins some elements of the original movie, which allowed it to be worth watching. And I know that they did use the live-action movie as a reference, because it isn't a coincidence that most of what happened in this movie also happened in that movie. And what aspects from the original movie did this film ruin? Well, you remember how the original movie had plenty of time spent with Roderick, Manny, and several others, including extra characters like Holly Hills, who was often there to help Greg and Rowley during their first year of middle school, and the character played by Karan Bar named Chirag Gupta, who was there to tell the story about the cheese touch. Well, I hope you guys said goodbye to them, because this movie omits so many aspects from the original film, to the point where it makes me ask, why should I even watch this movie when I could watch the live-action version and not only get the same experience, but also get that same experience, but so much better? With one of the reasons being that it's much more entertaining and has plenty of things to offer. What does this movie decide to do? Well, instead of focusing on the other aspects, this movie decides to hyper-focus on Greg and Rowley's friendship, to the point where all the other characters are either one-dimensional or one-note. And that is definitely understandable for why this movie decided to drop everything and focus only on Greg and Rowley, because the movie is only an hour long. And I actually mean that literally. Not an hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes like most movies are. The movie is only 60 minutes. So everything is constantly at breakneck speed to get to the next scene, to the point where certain motivations don't make that much sense now, and other scenes are severely rushed. For instance, remember how in the original live-action movie, how Greg and Rowley ended up accidentally antagonizing a group of teens on Halloween by saying that they're calling the cops, and Greg unintentionally damages their car, that they ended up holding a grudge against them? Well, that aspect of this movie is much weaker, as Greg and Rowley didn't do anything to really antagonize them that much. And what they do was by pure accident and through no fault of their own. It was the teens' fault in the first place as to why their car ends up getting damaged. In the original movie, it was Greg unintentionally but directly causing the teens' car to be scratched, so it was reasonable for them to hold a grudge there. Why would they even want to go after Greg and Rowley here when they don't do anything to really hold them responsible for their actions, and that it was the teens' fault? And when it comes to the friendship between Greg and Rowley, that too is portrayed much worse here than in the original film. I get that Greg was never really a likable character, nor was he ever portrayed in a positive light. Dog Days was an example of how heavily flawed he could be, but you could at least say that Greg was sort of caring towards others, and when he did lie, it wasn't ever out of malicious intent. Like, it was to avoid consequences, yes, but the most that he did was hurt others through his words and not physically. The football incident where Rowley has his arm broken is a good example of this. In the original film, yes, Rowley's arm also gets broken there, but the way that both versions execute this is like night and day. When Rowley broke his arm in that movie, Greg at least tried to take responsibility for his actions. It was only when Rowley started getting attention for his broken arm when Greg gets selfish. This version makes him even worse. Immediately when his best friend gets hurt, he's more focused with how he threw the football rather than the fact that his friend gets hurt due to his own actions. And not only that, this movie also gives us some new sequences that show him in an even worse light. As soon as he hears the news that Rowley's arm gets broken, he immediately tries to take advantage of this by using his best friend to get a table with him at lunch, and he also attempts to try and get away with it by having Rowley lie to his parents, which would have led to not only himself getting put into hot water, but Rowley would have gotten in trouble as well. By the way, going off script real quick, I know what you guys are going to say, and I'll address that right now. Yes, I am aware that Greg's mom caught wind about the fact that Greg told Rowley to lie to his parents. However, my point still stands regardless, because when Greg was about to tell Rowley's parents the truth, Greg chickens out of it at the last second, and he essentially gets away with lying. If you're going to do a remake of a movie from more than a decade ago, why change an aspect of the original which also showed Greg in an unfavorable light and make it worse? Because the original movie at least tried to give Greg some likability, they also completely removed the aspect of the original where Greg was escorting a group of kids home in the rain, and Greg mistakes a random car for the teenagers from Halloween and had the kids go into a hole, which gets Rowley suspended from the safety patrol, which is what led to Greg and Rowley's falling out. In this movie, on the other hand, what leads to Greg and Rowley falling out is a fight about his comic in the school newspaper. They also somehow made this movie even more mean-spirited in some aspects, with Greg's newspaper being heavily butchered by the school librarian, and because this movie has less characters to balance out this tone that the original movie had, it mixes this very bland and boring aura that the movie has, and mixes it with a lot of unpleasantness, which is the worst thing that you could do in a film like this. The level of butchering that this movie is given has this Disney live-action remake feeling to it, which leads me into another point in that this movie feels no different than one of Disney's live-action remakes, given that this movie is taking another film from more than 10 years ago and removing everything that made it work, while also making it feel much worse. The only difference is that this movie is animated, and instead of dragging everything out, this movie is drastically cut short, probably because of the fact that this movie was obviously rushed, given how the animation is like in this movie. I get what the film is trying to go for. This movie is trying to do a similar style as something like the Peanuts movie. Heck, when this movie was first announced, what we saw was actually very promising, as it has a similar style as the Peanuts movie, but with Diary of a Wimpy Kid. But due to the fact that this movie was extremely rushed, the final product led to a ton of problems. I get that this movie was not done directly by Disney, but the film was instead done by Bardell Entertainment, which is a name that you might recognize because they also did the animation for the Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild. Although, being done by another studio doesn't excuse the final product from coming out being executed this poorly, given the fact that the Captain Underpants movie came out looking just fine in spite of the animation also being outsourced. I'm willing to believe that Bardell Entertainment can do a lot better than this, because this movie was in production for only a year or so. Then shortly after this movie was released, the sequel is announced, and I already know what the animated version of Roderick Rules is like, because once again, there's already a live-action movie version of Roderick Rules. And going through Bardell's filmography, filmography and contributions, they've never animated a full project on their own before this movie, and the most that they did was additional animation on other shows or movies. The only exceptions to this is with movies like Once Upon a Forest, Space Jam, and Anastasia, which goes to show that Bardell can do good things when they aren't rushed. The blame is more on Disney because they didn't give Bardell enough time to polish up the movie. Same thing applies to the sequel Roderick Rules, and as Hopper from A Bug's Life would say,
"So it's your fault."
No, it wasn't me. It was...
First rule of leadership. Everything is your fault.
Funny enough, Bardell was also put in charge of animating the Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild, but they were once again rushed with what they were given. The major issue that I have with the animation in this movie is a minor thing, but it's still a distracting issue. I really don't like the fact that they gave every character dotted eyes in this movie, because given the fact that the animation in this movie is very soulless, the fact that the characters have dotted eyes make them feel very uncanny, and also gives this movie an uneasy feeling, like the characters don't feel natural. The reason why this works so much in the Peanuts movie, as well as the Captain Underpants movie, was because they were able to make the characters expressive enough to where it wasn't a distraction. Not to mention, the animation was polished enough in those two movies so that the dotted eyes weren't an issue. It's also the reason why dotted eyes are primarily used for 2D animation and not TV grade CGI or live action, because the results can be very...
Holy fish paste, what is that?
But with the animation in the 2021 Diary of a Wimpy Kid movie, the animation is incredibly unpolished, like the movie wasn't given enough time to render properly. So the movie ended up being on par with the Sony direct-to-video sequels, like the Open Season sequels and Surf's Up 2 Wave Mania. Only, this movie doesn't even have smooth animation. The animation is very choppy and stilted, which only makes the fact that every character has dotted eyes become a worse issue. But with all that being said and done, I'd recommend skipping out on this movie and just stick with the original live-action film, because in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a good reputation either, you'll have a much better time with that movie because it's much more fun and does actually feel more complete than this movie, while for the 2021 Diary of a Wimpy Kid movie, it's not the worst thing ever, but it is pretty soulless and unfinished. I mean, it's still better than that horrendous fourth movie, because I could at least look back and say that I felt bored with this movie, rather than being absolutely uncomfortable and disgusted like I did with The Long Haul, though that's not saying much. That's like saying that underdone toast is better than burnt toast that tastes disgusting. A year after this movie, the animated version of Roderick Rules was released, which I heard is no better, but I'll be saving that movie for a later point, as this review comes to a close.
Everything I